Well, Jim Molan is a retired Major General with the Australian Defence Forces. Jim, more than 800 complaints of sexual and physical abuse stretching over decades. What do you think is the best way for the government to proceed here?
I think it's absolutely essential, Fran, that they go for a royal commission now. I think that's only fair to victims. I think that if we go for a capped scheme, we are just opening up something for allegations that can never be tested. I think it's only fair to the accused perpetrators. Let's have them stand up and say what they said, as well as the victims stand up. But equally important, but of a second order activity, it's only fair to the ADF reputation. The words that you've just used in relation to culture really go to a secondary issue. The victims come first, and anyone who is still in the system, who could be threatened, and then the possible perpetrators, they got to be handled. But the continuing slur on the ADF's reputation by the use of the word culture is very, very important, Fran. I wrote something yesterday on the drum on this. I'm not too sure whether it's up there, but my full view on this is on the drum. But we got to go for a royal commission. And you know, Fran, the royal commission must include the minister's actions. So if the minister commissions a royal commission which says you can look at all of these terrible things that have happened in the ADF, less, of course, what I did.
Okay. All right. Well, leaving that aside for a minute, your call for a Royal Commission, I know, is not supported by everyone at senior levels in the Defence Forces or past senior commanders of the Defence Forces on the basis that some people think it will take too long and cost too much money. It's a waste of money and it's a waste of time, and the victims particularly need justice now. Do you have any truck with that argument?
Oh, I think that is a real problem. I think it's a real problem, but that's the characteristic of our court system. That's the characteristic of justice in this country. And if we're just happy to give money away, I'm very happy with that. These people sound as though they deserve it. They deserve absolutely everything that they get. If, of course, there is part of our system of justice as we're going through in our parliament that people are innocent until proven guilty. And if we give away, if we have a capped scheme which gives away money on the generalisations in the DLA Piper report, then there is certainly a whole bunch of people who also have rights. And they're the people who you could assume were the perpetrators.
Sure. There's sort of two classes of people maybe here. I mean, I'm not talking victims, perpetrators, but there's some of these allegations go back a long time to the 50s, presumably, and some of the victims are quite old now, and perhaps some of the perpetrators aren't even with us anymore. So in that sense, an apology and a cap compensation scheme might deal with some of these complaints. Some of them, and perhaps more worrying for the Defence Forces, are the suggestions within the DLA Piper review that in the more recent cases, for instance, those 24 rape allegations from the late 90s, very current, and the review says that Defence failed to call to account the perpetrators of these abuse and mismanagement, and some of these may be in, quote, in positions of senior and middle management within the ADF. Is it possible to separate the two and have a Royal Commission process for the more recent allegations and something else for those dating back to the 50s and 60s?
That might be a very good way of doing it. I mean, we handle different classes of people in different ways. I mean, people who are suffering from asbestos poisoning, they're handled in a way which to me seems totally full of injustice. That might be a good way to go, Fran, but I just get back to the point. Let's look after the victims. Let's make sure the perpetrators are found, if they are perpetrators, but they have right. Let's look after the ADF reputation, because that is critically important. But really, the minister's actions have got to be included in this. And we should be very suspicious, Fran, if the minister comes out and sets down a Royal Commission in which he says, look at everyone who did things wrong below me.
Yes, but Jim Molan, there's two different allegations here. I mean, you're talking about the minister, and you think there's the minister acted improperly at the time of the Skype sex scandal, so-called Skype sex scandal. But that's a different order of allegation that we're talking here of people having being victims of sexual and physical abuse. Are you troubled? What's your response to this suggestion that there are still serving members, senior members of the ADF, who were perhaps perpetrators and certainly witnesses to some of the worst counts of this abuse?
If you're a perpetrator, let's find you and let's deal with you in accordance with Australian law. A witness is very, very interesting. I have no idea, not being a legal person, I have no idea about the culpability of people who witnessed and did nothing, but let's find it and do it. But we can't do it on hearsay. We can't do it on hearsay. I like your idea, Fran, of splitting it up. Let's split it up. But there's got to be a way where we look at all the issues that surround this. Yes, look at the victims first. Then look at the accused perpetrators. Let's protect the reputation of the ADF, because I don't think it's a culture. I don't think it's a culture any more than it's a culture in the ABC.
Is it appropriate to say let's protect the reputation of the ADF, or let's refine the culture of the ADF, or redefine the culture of the ADF? Because this is 850 allegations almost, and as I say, some of them against potentially against serving members of the ADF.
You're absolutely right, Fran. It's 850 people, and everyone represents a failure of we, the leadership and the members of the Australian Defence Force. And no one backs off from that. What I'm saying, though, is a failure rate in personnel management of 0.08%. Now, there's not an organisation in Australia that wouldn't have that failure rate in relation to their people. This represents, over the period of the time, an average of 12 people per year. And there's been 1 million people serving the ADF over this period of time. Let's never forgive those that did it, as long as they did do it. Let's keep examining ourselves and what we do in the Australian Defence Force, but let's keep it in perspective. My full views are on the drum.
Talking of the we, Jim, I mean, you spent 40 years in the Army. You served proudly this institution, and it's not surprising that you're concerned to see that its reputation being sort of damaged in this way, as you say, with references to the culture within the Defence Forces. I think you started at Duntroon back in the 60s. Were you aware of systemic abuse, perhaps disguised as initiation at some point?
I went through what was a particularly stupid system at Duntroon, which was the old style of bastardisation. As a kid, and I joined at the age of 17 and graduated at the age of 21, to my credit, I never, ever applied that. Now, I don't know why I did. I just thought it was so un-Australian, it was ridiculous. We had a big crisis in the second year that I was at Duntroon, where a fellow tried to kill himself, not from sexual bastardisation, but from silly and pointless bastardisation, which we'd inherited from the West Point system and the Sandhurst system, and which had a brilliant idea behind it. And the idea was that if you are going to lead Australian troops, you should be subject to, you should know what it's like to be led. Now, it's a good principle. It's just so dumb in its application, it was laughable. And
the whole notion of bastardisation, of course, as we're seeing from some of these complaints, disguised a lot of really shocking things that have scarred people for their whole lives.
You're exactly right. But I don't believe that those activities represent a culture within the Australian Defence Force. We used to say to ourselves, Duntroon officers need to be re-socialised when they go to infantry battalions. So if you go as a lieutenant to an infantry battalion and you take the arrogant attitude that was sometimes brought out by Duntroon graduates, I tell you what, it took you a millisecond from a platoon sergeant to get it out of you. So it's un-Australian, and you're right in everything we do, but let's get it into perspective, Fran. This is, if it's systemic, it's also systemic in almost every part of Australian culture. We are better than almost every other part of Australian culture, and that was proven in the Heriock report.
Okay, Jim Molan, thank you very much for joining us on Breakfast.
Thanks, Fran, a pleasure.
Jim Molan is a retired Major General with the ADF. He was a commander in Iraq, and as he just told us, he wrote an essay about this on The Drum, ABC The Drum. You can have a look if you want to hear more of his views. It's 24 minutes past 8.